In the previous video, we looked at a number of experiments from social psychology that some have used to defend what might be called a situationist challenge to free will. In this video, we're going to start out by reviewing the social psychology experiments themselves. Then we're going to look at how someone might interpret the results of those experiments, and that's going to lead into the situationist challenge to free will. We'll talk about situationism itself. Then we'll talk about this question of could you have done otherwise? And this will lead into a discussion of the difference between compulsion and influence. Lastly, we'll look at pessimistic and more optimistic takes on these experiments and free will. The first experiment was the bystander experiment, where a person was put in a room talking over an intercom and they'd hear a panicked voice of someone who thought they were having a stroke. And when they heard other voices over the intercom that they believed could also hear this person, they were less likely to help. And even when they did, it oftentimes took longer for them to sort of look for help. There's the Stanford prison experiment, where students were assigned at random a role of a prisoner or a guard in a makeshift prison in a sort of Stanford University basement. And the sort of students seemed to fall into their roles such that many sort of guards turned out to be bullies and used psychological and physical tormenting of the prisoners, and the prisoners sort of psychologically fell into their role as well. There was the Milgram's obedience experiments involving the shocking of the learner, and it looks like when the scientist tells them to shock, most people went all the way up to the top of the sort of voltage. There was the phone booth experiment that I mentioned. It was not in your book, but we discussed, where if someone found a coin in a phone booth, it looked like they were more likely to help a stranger who had dropped papers outside that phone book when they left. In the honesty box experiment, whether there were a picture of eyes looking at you or a picture of flowers in a box, it seemed to affect how much money people would give for the drinks that they were taking in a psychology department office. So if you're still confused about what happened in any of those experiments, I'd suggest you go back to the previous video or go back to your book to at least get more details about the first three that were mentioned on the last slide. Anyways, once we are clear about what the experiments are, how should we interpret the results? What do they show about human behavior? Well, most of the experiments are focused on what are called situational factors. And these include things such as how tired we are, if there's an authority figure giving us sort of orders, what our current mood is, our parents' expectations of us, etc. So depending upon the researcher and depending upon the experiment, these situational factors are often contrasted with a person's character traits: honesty, kindness, meanness, selfishness. Those are character traits of a person. You might take an honest person and a dishonest person, and you might put them in the same situation. So there's a difference between those character traits and the situation in which that kind of character is placed. And a subject's reasons. So in the case of the bystander experiment, what you're changing is the situation. In one situation, there are no other bystanders. You're the only person who could help. And in the other situation, there are multiple people that can help. There are maybe 4 other sort of strangers that can hear this person in need as well. That's a change in the person's situation, but it doesn't change who the person is. It doesn't change their reasons either, because you have just as much reason to help a person who's having a stroke, whether there's 1 person watching or 4 people watching. Situational factors, such as our current mood, parental expectations, how many people are watching us, are often thought to be largely out of our control. Now, these experiments then are often thought to illustrate the power that our situations have over our behavior, that these situational factors oftentimes influence the choices that we make and the behaviors that we perform. And if those situational factors are largely out of our control, that would then show how factors out of our control seem to largely influence our behavior. So here's a little diagram I think that's important for understanding what's going on here. So this is a picture of a person, and so the top there is their head. And what I've tried to do is sort of try to describe what's going on internally in their own mind. So these are what you might call internal factors. Internal factors include things like that person's own values, their goals, their desires, their beliefs, their morals, their preferences, their character traits. So whether they're a kind person, whether they're an honest person, etc. But now, so there's all those internal factors, but there's also these situational factors that are external factors. They're sort of outside the person. It's the situation, you take that person with those values, goals, desires, and you put them in a certain situation where maybe their parents have certain expectations of them that are sort of acting on them. Maybe an authority figure gives them various commands. Maybe other people are watching them. Maybe they're sleep deprived from the past 2 days. Maybe their teacher gave them an exam due date coming up. There's certain roles that they have. They're put in the role of a student or a child or a friend. There's certain societal structures that are acting on them. There's certain stereotypes that other people in our society have of that person. So these are influences that are sort of outside that person. These are external factors. And what these experiments are thought to show is that these external factors oftentimes have a large influence on people's behavior. So, for instance, in Milgram's obedience experiment, many of the people who were the teacher in that experiment, they sort of had that sort of sweating. If you ask them what their values were, they didn't want to cause harm. They didn't desire to cause harm. And their morals were such that they believed that flipping the switch was the morally wrong thing to do. They were utterly convinced that that was the morally wrong thing to do. So internally, their morals are saying this is wrong. But there's that external factor of the situation, namely the speaker giving a command. And it looks like that command sort of overrides their own moral beliefs, such that the external factor seems to have a larger influence over their behavior in this particular situation than the morals do, those internal factors. All right, so applying this to some of the experiments. So the presence of others makes one less likely to help, since it's in our nature for this sort of to diffuse our sense of responsibility. We think, well, others might be able to help. Others might be able to help better than we are. We sort of diffuse, sort of spread out the responsibility, not just among us, but among others. And this makes us more likely to sort of jump in. Now notice, the idea here is there's a situational factor, and then there's this sort of supposed feature, sort of automatic feature of the way people process information. We automatically sort of spread out responsibility amongst the people that are present without even thinking about it. People tend to behave in ways that fit the expectations that they associate with a certain role that they fall under due to our natural tendency to conform. So yet again, in the prison experiment, a student was given the role of a prisoner. Other students were given the role of a guard. And we have certain ideas associated with those roles. You get those ideas from your society, from watching Orange is the New Black on Netflix. Again, even if you don't think that that's the right way to behave, you still have those expectations. You have those sort of stereotypes associated with those roles. And then there's a natural tendency to conform to other people's expectations, sort of automatically, without even sort of thinking about it. This is sometimes known as the sort of stereotype threat, this sort of worry that there's this risk that you're going to fall into sort of a stereotype. And lastly, people also seem to have a greater tendency to act immorally if told to do so by someone they perceive as an authority figure, due to, one, we have a natural tendency to displace responsibility onto the authority figure. We think, well, look, if they're telling me to do it, it's on them, not me. But moreover, we also have it's sort of evolutionally programmed into us to have a tendency to defer to authorities like parents or parental figures, because this is important to our survival. And so this seems to be part of the sort of automatic processing of our brain, that there's a tendency for us to defer to those that we perceive to be an authority figure. All right, now, putting all that together, many people think these experiments support a view known as situationism. So this is the view that people's actions or behavior are better explained by the influence of situational factors than by a person's own character traits or reasons. So when you think about that diagram I showed you before, it's the claim that those external influences of the situation that the person is placed in sort of has a larger influence over how a person behaves than those internal influences such as character traits or their sort of reasons, values, desires, etc. Now we might separate this into sort of two different theses. There's the extreme version that says all human behavior is entirely determined by the situational factors. Or there's a more modest version that just says human behavior is largely influenced by these situational factors and influence much more than we usually think. So that situationism can form the basis of an argument against free will. So I'm going to take that extreme version of situationism since it makes the argument cleaner. So premise 1, all human behavior is entirely driven by the situation in which people find themselves and the effects these situations have on automatic behavior producing mechanisms. So for instance, in the Milgram experiment, they are placed in a situation where there's a perceived authority figure giving them a command, and then there's this sort of automatic natural tendency in humans, sort of built into us, to naturally defer to authority figures. All right. Now, if premise 1 is true, the claim is no one has free will, therefore we lack free will. So the first premise is an empirical claim about how our behavior is produced, and the point of the experiments is meant to support this premise. Premise 2 is a philosophical premise that is essentially saying, look, doesn't free will require that we are in control of our actions? But what we are those sort of internal factors. It's our values, our beliefs, our reasons, our weighing of sort of pros and cons. But if it's the external factors, the situational factors that's in control of our behavior, then it looks like we're not in control. At least the things inside our own sort of mind are not in control, and thus we do not have free will. All right, so one way of interpreting this argument is that we lack free will because the situation we're in compels a person to act in a certain way. And that kind of compulsion thereby robs the person of any control or choice in the matter. So the problem here is the way in which the situation compels a person to act. Now, here's a quote from Milgram where you see this kind of move. Some subjects were totally convinced of the wrongness of what they were doing, but could not bring themselves to make an open break with authority. So notice he says they could not. They didn't have the ability to do so. They were compelled by that situation, despite the fact that it went against these internal factors, namely their moral beliefs. So it looks like Milgram is saying that subjects lacked the ability to do otherwise. It looks like they lacked that deep openness that was associated with at least some ideas of free will. Now, Mealy also quotes a science correspondent, Sandra Blakesley, saying that in navigating the world and deciding what is rewarding, humans are closer to zombies than sentient beings much of the time. The idea is it looks like the situation is sort of playing us as a sort of fiddle. We're just sort of mindlessly moving through, and the situation is compelling us, but we're not, sort of our own conscious mind is not what's in control there. So we can argue against this kind of extreme situations argument in two ways. First, the first problem is it looks like it might be a hasty generalization. In the experiments, participants are subjected to extreme coercion and manipulation by Zimbardo in the prison experiment and by Milgram in the sort of obedience experiments. Now, maybe the situational factors compel behavior in these extreme cases. And so maybe people didn't have free will in those scenarios. However, it seems like a big leap. We shouldn't assume that those extreme cases are representative of how behavior is produced in more ordinary circumstances where we don't have as much sort of coercion or manipulation acting on us in those situations. Secondly, it looks like there might actually be some counterexamples to at least the extreme version of situationism. If situations really did fully determine and compel our behavior, then we should expect all people to behave in identical ways when we put them into the same situation, if the situation is all that's doing the work. However, that's not the case. Some participants overcame the bystander effect. Some guards resisted the temptation to bully the prisoners, and some participants refused the orders to administer all the shocks to the learner. Some stopped after 20 shocks instead of going all the way to the end. So it looks as if all the experiments we've seen, all they could support without any further argument is that situational factors have a large influence on our behavior. Perhaps much larger than we typically think, but it seems like they can't get all the way to the claim that situations completely determine our behavior. But could this still challenge the existence of free will? Could the large influence by these external factors still be enough to rob us of free will? Well, that depends. How much influence is a large influence? How much external influence on our decisions and behaviors would be too much? When does compulsion or manipulation become excessive? Is there anything we can do to help us resist the tendencies produced by these situational factors? Those are the questions you need to answer to try to determine whether or not this would still be a threat when we move to maybe a more modest version of situationism. When considering these questions, you might be a pessimist or an optimist. According to the pessimist take, these situational factors have a large influence on human behavior and choices. Those situational factors are largely out of our control and make us more or less likely to behave in various ways. Unfortunately, there's just nothing we can do about those influences. And whether we give in or resist the situational influences is largely a matter of luck that depends on other factors that are out of our control, such as our biology and our upbringing. Thus, we have no control over whether we resist or give in to the situational factors, and we thereby lack free will. So this would say, even if the situation doesn't fully determine our behavior, it's still enough of an influence to make it the case that we are not in control of what we do. Mealy has a more optimistic take. On his view, he says, yes, situational factors have a strong influence on human behavior, and maybe much more so than we thought. However, he thinks we're not in the unfortunate situation where there's nothing we can do about this. He says we can use education as a tool that can help give ourselves control of our behavior and sort of gain power over those situational influences. He says, as an example, now that you know about the bystander effect, that knowledge, that education, you have a better chance of resisting your inclination to remain passive the next time you find yourself in a group that witnesses an emergency. So by becoming aware of these sort of biases that we have, by becoming aware of the ways in which our situations can influence us, we can thereby use that knowledge to combat that influence and make a decision on the basis of our own sort of reasoning there, sort of take control back. Now, he also mentions that research on implementation intentions discussed earlier, where when you make plans ahead of time that involve not just an intention to do something, but an intention that includes a sort of plan of where, when, and how you're going to do it, you can sort of think, okay, when I find myself in a situation, what am I going to do to try to resist the bystander effect? You could say, I'm going to come up with a plan where I'm going to sort of note the sort of situation, I'm going to name the effect, and I'm going to take these actions. And coming up with that plan might make you more likely to be successful in resisting those influences. All right, so here's a case for you to consider when trying to compare these two interpretations. So Milgram's obedience study was actually motivated by high-profile cases of the trials of Nazi officers from World War II. Now, many ordinary German citizens became sort of rank-and-file soldiers that helped commit terrible atrocities. So one thing that Milgram was interested in was how could these seemingly ordinary people get involved and help commit these absolutely terrible atrocities? And he thought essentially that our natural tendency to obey authority was thought to explain how that could happen. All right, now, when we think about this, a pessimistic interpretation and optimistic interpretation might see things slightly differently. On the pessimistic reaction, someone might say, look, for most ordinary persons, if they had been born and raised in Germany during the 1920s, so if they had an identical upbringing as the Nazi officers, then they too would have helped commit these horrible atrocities. And the idea here is, look, we think of ourselves as good people. I think of you as sort of good people. But we think we would never do anything sort of terrible to sort of harm others. But now, imagine you were put in a situation where you had a completely different upbringing. You had completely different influences over your life. You had different sort of parents teaching you different things. You lived in a sort of different sort of culture ever since the moment you were born. Well, largely then the idea is, well, your values, your preferences, your desires would have been different given that other sort of upbringing. And so in that situation, you too might have done something morally atrocious. So that's the pessimistic reaction. And so someone would say, the fact that you are doing good things and that you're a good person is largely a matter of luck. The fact that you just that you weren't put in that situation. Now, an optimistic reaction says, look, now that we know about and are aware of the dangers of our tendency to obey authorities, we can use that knowledge to resist its influence on us. So a proper moral education can help to inculcate in a person their own sort of internal ability to control their impulses. So moral education can actually help us gain sort of free control over our more sort of natural tendencies. Going back to this sort of picture, we can see this pessimistic and the optimistic interpretation. According to the optimistic interpretation, when we gain knowledge of the ways that all these sort of red factors, these external factors can influence us, that knowledge can sort of protect us and sort of shield us from their influence so we can better make use of our own internal factors like the values, goals, beliefs, desires, morals that we have to guide our actions. On the pessimistic interpretation, someone might say, but look, those values you have, those goals you have, those desires you have, even those are the result of external influences like upbringing, biology. You didn't have any choice of whether you were born into a Christian family or a Muslim family or an atheist family. You didn't have any choice whether you were born into a loving family or an abusive family. You didn't have any choice whether you were born in the United States, Canada, China, South Africa, the UK, Russia. You didn't have any choice whether you were born into a rich family or a poor family, Democrat family, Republican family, independent family. You didn't have any choice whether you were born to parents that sort of provide you with healthy meals every day or whether they weren't able to do so. But all those factors have a huge influence on the things you believe, the things you desire. And so even though those things seem like internal factors, part of what makes you, you, those things were themselves shaped by all these external influences that you didn't have control over. They were shaped by that earlier situation. All right, so that's on the sort of pessimistic interpretation. Which of those is more correct? That's a tricky thing to say. Something for you all to think about. All right, so that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to wrap up our discussion of Mealy's book on free will by trying to sort of assess the overall impact of the scientific evidence on the philosophical issue of free will. See you then. Bye-bye.